Mark Twain is credited for once saying, "Whiskey's for drinking, water's for fighting." Out west, where water can be scarce, this is far too true. Now, back in 2022, the New Mexico Supreme Court decided in favor of the plaintiffs, in this case, the Adobe Whitewater Club of New Mexico, that under the New Mexico Constitution, the unappropriated water of every natural stream, perennial or torrential, within the state of New Mexico is hereby declared to belong to the public. Now, I can't help but think about the seven principles of North American wildlife conservation when I think about water conservation. Almost all of these foundational seven principles should also apply to water conservation, in my opinion. And I want to use an example that came up in a debate between my friend Clark and I a few weeks ago while we were out elk hunting. The red icon in the picture here was where we saw a big bull elk crossing the Rio Chama as he was moving from the south in the Santa Fe National Forest onto private property on the north side of the river. But when we saw him, he was standing in the water. Clark, perhaps because it was his tag burning a hole in his pocket, argued that given the New Mexico Stream Access Law, this situation was just like fishing. But let's come back to this. This all came to a head after 2015 when the New Mexico legislature amended the Constitution to add the following sentence. No person engaged in hunting, fishing, trapping, camping, hiking, sightseeing, the operation of watercraft, or any other recreational use shall walk or wade onto private property through non-navigable public water or access public water via private property unless the private property owner or lessee or person in control of private lands has expressly consented in writing. Now, according to those regulations, a non-navigable public water is a water that was not used at the time of statehood as a highway for commerce over which trade and travel was or may have been conducted. This 2015 amendment then required that the New Mexico State Game Commission outline a process for landowners to obtain formal certificate allowing them to close portions of otherwise public water that flowed across their property. This contradiction between the state constitution and this new amendment invited the lawsuit brought by the Adobe Whitewater Club. And this map is just kind of a informational graphic of where some of those certificates were issued or were pending at the time of the lawsuit. So after the New Mexico Supreme Court decided in favor of the plaintiffs, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to review the case further. This means that the New Mexico Supreme Court ruling is the ultimate law of the land in New Mexico. The New Mexico Supreme Court ruled that while the stream beds are technically owned by the landowner, anyone recreated in the publicly owned water crossing private property has essentially an easement to access that water. Now, while the court's ruling grants the public right to access the water, the public cannot trespass on private land to access the water. So the New Mexico Supreme Court reaffirmed the prohibition against crossing private land to access a river or stream, but it also held that the public could walk or wade on the stream bed for recreational purposes. Semantic, but this is important. In reaching this conclusion, the court also invalidated the permits that the New Mexico Game Commission had issued to private landowners to close their streams from public use, as this was a violation of the state constitution. Despite this ruling, the New Mexico Attorney General's office has received numerous complaints from anglers and outside advocacy groups that landowners continue to block access to publicly owned rivers and streams. Photographic evidence, like this shown here on the slide, appears to show that some of the fences consist of barbed wire at or below the water line, constituting a clear public safety hazard for anglers and others accessing public waters. So the court's ruling has not prevented further controversy or conversations on this topic. It remains unclear how private landowners should manage fencing and livestock barriers, or what constitutes reasonable access, and which, if any, agency has the authority to enforce the court's ruling. In the meantime, landowners share a variety of concerns over the ruling that I think are fairly valid. How will the law enforcement be handled? Will streams on private land be law enforcement free zones? Or will law enforcement officials be able to access those streams through private land without permission? And is there a role for the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish, given that a lot of the recreation is wildlife related? So here's that map that I showed earlier, and here's where we saw that big bull elk. And I now have permission to raft or kayak on pretty much any flowing water in New Mexico. And if I want to get back into fishing, I can do that too, as long as I don't trespass to get to these flowing waters. But what about my friend Clark's question? Let's say he was able to take a legal shot at that bull elk crossing the Rio Chama a few weeks ago. And let's say we were able to get to it and harvest it without trespassing. Are we in our legal constitutional right to do so? This might sound absurd, but this is the exact question that waterfowl hunters still have to wrangle with in New Mexico. And something we talked about earlier this semester is how to address funding shortages with the number of hunters declining nationwide. Given this obstacle to hunting, I would like to offer that increasing access to streams and recreation, both directly involving wildlife and indirectly through accessing their habitat, should be considered for taxing, like the Pittman-Robertson Act, to generate conservation funds. Opening stream access opens both types of recreation opportunities, and if tied with targeted taxes, it may help ease the loss of hunting-related tax dollars. So, uh, this is really interesting to me. I hope it was interesting for you, and I look forward to seeing your policy briefs. Thanks.